For 7 years now, it's been getting more and more obvious just how badly the Saudis and Emiratis misjudged their 2015 invasion of Yemen. If they had known the country's history, they could have seen just how doomed their effort was from the very beginning. In part 1 of this series, we covered Yemen's 2 victories over the Ottoman Empire. Today we will look into the next 50 years of Yemen's history and cover the country's humiliation of the greatest empire the world has ever seen, the British world system. Much like the destruction of the Ottoman hopes in Yemen, conflict with rivals was a key part of London's defeat. The British built their first outpost in Yemen as the Ottomans fell, and other countries decided to give it a whirl as the British were chased out. Even some newly independent countries decided to try their luck in Yemen. In the 1950s, while Saudi Arabia's worldwide apparatus of fundamentalist subversion was still just being built, Egypt came roaring back onto the Yemeni scene. The 1952 overthrow of Egypt's British-owned monarch by Gamal Abdel Nasser inflamed nationalist feeling across the Arab world. His speeches were heard across both Yemens through newly available transistor radios. 1958 saw Syria and Egypt join together as the United Arab Republic, which seemed very significant at the time. In the 1950s, the imams that had ruled northern Yemen since the First World War flirted with Nasser and Arab nationalism, something they would soon come to regret. The British that controlled southern Yemen, of course, saw Nasser as a great threat. They had tried and failed to overthrow him with an invasion of Egypt in 1956. This British failure to hold on to Egypt highlights why they were so eager to hold on to Yemen. By the 1950s, the British had lost India and were struggling mightily to hold on to what was left of their African and Asian empires. Yemen, and Aden specifically, was Britain's last great stronghold by the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a trade route of massive importance that was getting more valuable by the year as oil exports from the Middle East increased. If the British Empire could hold on to Aden, then it could still claim to be a major world power. World War II and its aftermath made Aden the world's second busiest port, and the expansion of military facilities in Yemen made it clear that the British intended to stay. In September 1962, Ahmad, the old imam in the north, died. His successor, Badr, was targeted by a coup before the month was out. Badr survived, but he had to flee the capital. The newly declared Yemen Arab Republic did have some popular support, but it quickly became clear that it would need significant Egyptian help to take the country from Badr, his royalist forces, and their Saudi sponsors. The Egyptian troop presence quickly reached the tens of thousands. Nasser's forces were initially welcomed by many, but the Egyptians' contemptuous treatment of Yemenis and their years-long failure to end the war bred resentment. The 1960s Civil War highlights an important point. Some like to claim that the war in Yemen is about religion, but it really isn't. The Zaydi Shia sect prevalent in northern Yemen is actually much closer to Sunni orthodoxy than it is to the Shia practice of Iran. In the 1930s, and today, when it works for propaganda and political alignments, religion is used to rally support in the fight between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. But in the North Yemeni Civil War of the 1960s, Saudi Arabia was directly aligned with and heavily subsidized the Zaydi Shia elites who were trying to hold on to the country back then. In today's political alignment, Saudi Arabia is fighting Zaydi elites that are very similar to the Saudi allies of the 1960s. These alignments have always been about political convenience, not religious commitment. As North Yemen dissolved into invasion and civil war, British control of the South was falling apart as well. The passions of revolution and anti-imperialism were hard to confine on the northern side of the border. The Egyptians failing to control the north were the sworn enemies of the British failing to hold on in the south, but they had the same problem, not being able to control Yemenis. The British attempted to maintain control of the situation and proposed a number of solutions that would allow them to hold on to the military base at Aden they had been expanding, but it was all for naught. The British found themselves retreating into their strongholds as they watched the petty southern sultanates they had nominally been protecting fall one by one as rival groups of nationalists fought to see who would control the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen that was now emerging as a unified southern Yemeni entity for the first time. As the name implies, the British weren't just chased out, they were replaced by the only explicitly communist state that ever existed in the Arab world. It may have been British influence in education that made this bizarre result possible in the first place, but it was a pretty stunning humiliation nonetheless. With the belated retreat of the British on November 29, 1967, Yemen found itself more purely on the front lines of the Cold War and subject to the tender mercies of the Soviet and American empires. These empires often disagreed with their local clients, but by and large, the Saudis were on the US side, and as long as Nasser was alive, Egypt was more on the Soviet side. Like the conflict of today, the 1960s Civil War was a proxy war. But back then, the Saudis were a lot smarter. In this new conflict, the Saudis have reversed their position, allowing Iran to take the smarter, easier role. In the 1960s, Nasser's Egypt spent billions of dollars, importing large numbers of troops and staking Egypt's prestige and vision for the region on the outcome. Saudi Arabia was far more involved in Yemen back then than Iran is in today's war, but the dynamic is similar. The Saudis supported the country's traditional Zaidi leaders, but mostly with money and weapons, content to let Yemenis and Egyptians do the fighting and suffering. It was a good, cheap way to bleed an enemy. A sensible strategy that Saudi Arabia apparently forgot about entirely by 2015, when they decided to step into the role of the Egyptian losers. The result of the 1960s Civil War is confusing. Egypt's side, the modern-facing republic, won, but Egypt definitely lost. The Yemeni distraction contributed to Nasser's loss in the Six-Day War with Israel and the end of the Arab nationalist cause Saudi Arabia had found so threatening. The 1960s Yemeni Civil War, which has since become known as Egypt's Vietnam, also soured Egypt on foreign intervention. So even though Saudi Arabia's side lost the Civil War, they ended up as the outside power with the most influence in Yemen. Despite joining Saudi Arabia's Yemen invasion coalition on paper in 2015, the Egyptians have wisely mostly stayed out. They've had enough of trying to invade Yemen, thank you very much. The Egyptians, like the Ottomans and the British, had learned to fear Yemen. When the Egyptian troops retreated in 1967, one could be forgiven for assuming that the Yemen Arab Republic would have fallen to the Saudis and the Royalists as quickly as the Afghan government fell in 2021. The Royalists quickly besieged the capital, Sana'a. But once the Republic lost its tens of thousands of imperialist Egyptian protectors, the Yemeni people decided they preferred the Republic to the Royalist side that was still fully funded by the Saudis. Sana'a withstood the siege, and the Saudis eventually gave up on the last of the Zaidi imams, who lived out his days in London. This is a key lesson for those who oppose Houthi power in Yemen. Most Yemenis don't seem to like the Houthis much or want to be under their government. It's just that they prefer them to outside invaders and their proxies. If Saudi Arabia left, then perhaps Houthi power would evaporate just as quickly as the power of the last imam evaporated after the Egyptians left in 1967. The end of the Civil War brought new power relations to northern Yemen. The traditional Zaidi Shia religious elite was out along with the imams. Though the new republic was on the surface run by political parties based in the cities, power in the countryside was held by a balance of territorial tribal coalitions who were vastly strengthened by the unseating of Yemen's old religious elite. This new, supposedly modern and secular system was just as open to Saudi influence as the more religious system it had replaced. Money is the universal solvent, and Saudi Arabia, even after this past decade of lower oil prices, has always had dramatically more money than any Yemeni actor. Saudi Arabia knew how to make the newly empowered tribal system work in their favor, though of course Yemen's resistance to this influence has been a constant as well. The first peacetime Republican government was seen by Yemenis as becoming too pro-Saudi, so it was ousted in a coup in 1974. Ibrahim al-Hamdi, the coup winner, is probably the only Yemeni leader of the 20th century that is remembered fondly. He was popular and seen as working towards the unification of northern Yemen after its civil war and towards unification with the south as well. But he was anti-Saudi, which few doubt was a big part of his being assassinated just 3 years into his time in power. Ironically, Saudi Arabia may have made Hamdi's career as well as ended it. The 1973 oil crisis was a tragedy for most of the developing world, but not for Yemen. Saudi Arabia went from being ridiculously rich to absurdly rich, and they needed workers to build their country. The Saudis hadn't sorted out their slave labor deals with South Asia yet, and the Yemenis were massive beneficiaries. The 1970s and 1980s seemed to have been a sort of golden age in Yemen. Only a few migrants got seriously wealthy, but hundreds of thousands of Yemenis were able to send money back to their villages for cars, houses, schools, and other infrastructure. Government in both Yemens was a mess, but times were good. Of course, all this money did help Saudi influence grow even further. Surprisingly enough, it's religion that ended up sabotaging the Saudi domination of Yemen. If they had stuck to bribing government heads and dominating tribal gift exchange networks, then today's Yemen would probably be almost as reliable a Saudi client as Bahrain is. But the Saudi religious establishment, with a lot of US encouragement, got greedy. It wasn't enough for Yemen to be a majority Sunni Saudi client. It had to be Wahhabi too. While the CIA and Saudi Arabia were creating the jihadi networks that kicked the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, radicalized the whole Muslim world, and eventually did 9/11, Yemen was one of their happiest hunting grounds. Yemen was physically close to Saudi Arabia, culturally similar in a tribal sense, and much, much poorer. Saudi imperialism was never just about creating fighters for Wahhabi Islam. It was also about changing the societies those fighters came from. Zaydi Shia and Sunni Islam are very similar, but Saudi Arabia's extreme Wahhabi version of Sunni Islam has no tolerance for other kinds of Sunni practice, let alone a Shia practice that could be tied to Iran, no matter how loosely. Saudi Arabia spent billions trying to stamp out North Yemen's traditional religion, which created the Houthi reaction that eventually destroyed Saudi Arabia's imperial plans. But that's a story that'll have to wait for part 3 of this series, How Yemen Beat the Cold War, coming sometime soon. Until then, I'd ask you to consider that civil war that ripped up North Yemen in the 1960s. For years, Egypt, like the Saudis today, failed to defeat the old Zaydi Shia elite. But in the end, all they had to do to undermine that elite was leave. Do you think Saudi Arabia could use a similar strategy against the Houthis today? Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. And check out my book, Avoiding the British Empire, if you want to learn more about the rise and fall of the First World System. Thanks.